Under the overcast sky of early spring, Cassandra Miller stepped out of the courthouse in a quiet New England town she hadn't visited in over a decade. The air smelled faintly of wet brick and old paper, and the cool wind tangled her scarf as she tucked a manila folder into her satchel. Inside was the official court order, declaring her the legal executor of her late Uncle Henry's estate, a role she had neither expected nor particularly desired. Their relationship had always been respectful but distant. She sent holiday cards. He mailed her antique books with bookmarks placed on random pages, often with handwritten notes in the margins. Nothing warm, nothing cold. Just precise. When the clerk read the statement aloud that Henry Miller had left no spouse, no children, and named Cassandra as his sole executor, she felt a strange blend of disbelief and inevitability. As if something quietly structural in her life had just shifted and locked into place. The estate itself was a modest, but highly unusual one, a half-acre plot bordering a state-managed lake in rural Franklin County, with a dilapidated fishing cabin, overgrown fencing, and according to old documents, access to a direct utility corridor that hadn't been updated since the late 1980s. And that last part stuck with her. Why would he leave her land? And not just a bank account or the value of it. Cassandra wasn't an outdoors person. She lived in Boston, lectured at the university in property law, and had no emotional attachment to scrubland with invasive brush and possibly a family of raccoons. But something about the way his will had been written, the deliberate absence of explanation, the clinical legal phrasing made her pause. Henry, like most Millers, didn't do anything by accident. 11 days after receiving the official papers, she finally cleared her schedule enough to drive out. She took the less scenic highway, alone, without telling anyone where she was going. She didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a property check, confirm the address, verify the boundary markers, assess the damage, maybe take photos for the appraisal firm. Nothing emotional. But when she turned off the main road and saw the bright orange mesh fencing stretched across the gravel path, her heart dropped, as if her instincts had known all along this wasn't going to be straightforward. A small laminated sign fluttered in the breeze, zip-tied to a crooked stake. This land has been transferred. Private development pending. No trespassing. Below, in smaller font, it named a company she had never heard of and a QR code that led to a dead link. She didn't cross the barrier. She didn't even touch it. Instead, she stood there, half buried in gravel, gripping the leather strap of her bag as wind rustled through the half-dead trees. Her mind went silent. Not with panic, but with professional clarity. The kind that came during courtroom hearings and arbitration sessions, moments when emotion only complicated what needed to be done. This was her property. Her name was on the court file. She was the only legal executor. And yet, someone had not only accessed the plot but moved to sell it without notice, without consent, and evidently without fear of consequence. Back at her car, she opened her laptop using the courthouse Wi-Fi and began searching county records. She found the most recent sale listed as a tax forfeiture transfer dated just 6 weeks earlier. That was before she had even been formally notified of her uncle's death. The buyer? A holding company with a name that sounded like a dental practice. No contact info, no listed agent. Just a file number. She printed the screen to PDF, backed it up twice, and emailed it to herself and her colleague David, a real estate attorney who'd co-authored 2 articles with her on title irregularities. Then she sat still in the driver's seat, staring at the orange mesh in the rearview mirror, her fingers still on the trackpad. She wasn't angry. Not yet. But the sensation rising in her chest wasn't confusion either. It was the first pulse of something sharper, colder. Cassandra Miller wasn't naive. She knew how municipalities buried mistakes under paperwork and how land changed hands, and through loopholes no one wanted to admit existed. But this wasn't theory anymore. This was hers. And now it was missing. Cassandra sat in the county auditor's office, her court-issued executor paperwork spread across the counter between her and a young clerk whose nameplate read Nolan. The air in the room was dry and motionless, heavy with the scent of dust and something stale, like long-forgotten carpet glue. She watched him scan the documents while she tried to ignore the faint tick of a wall clock she couldn't see. Her patience was precise, not performative. She didn't fidget or sigh. She simply waited with the same expression she wore when reviewing flawed legal memos from distracted students. Nolan typed slowly, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the screen in front of him. Cassandra knew the rhythm of someone finding something they hadn't expected. "There's a record here of the transfer," he muttered, "filed under Galveston Land Management. Looks like it went through under tax forfeiture protocol, certificate of claim filed, title transferred." His voice trailed off. She leaned forward slightly. "Was it contested?" He shook his head. "Not officially, but there's a prior note in the internal log. Something flagged the parcel as estate pending. It should have been on hold until verification was complete, and that flag was overridden. See, this line's been struck through. Who overrode it?" Nolan didn't answer immediately. He tapped a few keys, then grimaced faintly. "I can't access that from this terminal. Access logs are limited. You'd have to file a request. They might send you through records compliance." Cassandra didn't blink. "So someone saw the estate flag and pushed it aside. That doesn't just happen." The clerk looked uncomfortable. "Technically it can, but it's not usual." She gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder with a precise motion. She didn't bother with accusations or threats. It wasn't time for that yet. Instead, she nodded once and left the building, steps measured, mind already moving ahead. She walked through the main square toward the law firm of a colleague who had worked with her on a case involving improperly seized agricultural land. His office was cluttered and smelled of old paper and carpet cleaner, but he was sharp. When she laid out the timeline and showed him the estate documents, the parcel records, and the transfer data, he frowned. No theatrics. Just concern tempered with calculation. He took out a notepad and began listing questions, not for her, but for himself. Then he spoke, calmly but with weight. "They jumped the line. This isn't normal. Forfeitures move slow. It takes time to build up a case for claim under abandonment or delinquency. This one moved fast, which tells me someone asked it to." He asked who Galveston Land Management was, and when Cassandra said she hadn't found anything meaningful, no office, no actual agent, he looked unsurprised. "Shell entity. These outfits pop up to grab land cheap, then vanish after flipping it through 3 or 4 hands. It would be buried under layers by the time anyone tried to untangle ownership." She didn't like how quiet her thoughts had become. Not blank, but focused. The way her brain operated when she had to move fast through academic bureaucracy to fix a disaster no one else noticed until it became public. But this wasn't theoretical. It wasn't hypothetical. Her name was on court documents, and someone had removed her rights from the chain of authority without her knowledge or consent. They began assembling the next steps immediately. File for injunctive relief to freeze all development activity. Serve notice of intent to dispute title under probate jurisdiction. If Galveston tried to bulldoze their way through the process, they'd be met with certified filings and court orders. It wouldn't stop them permanently, but it would slow them down enough to force mistakes. That's when you start pulling threads. Cassandra insisted on having every communication on record. No calls, no meetings, all in writing. Back in her apartment, Cassandra gathered every piece of mail she had received about the estate and laid it out in chronological order on the table. She checked envelopes, postmarks, timing comparing them with when the parcel had supposedly changed hands. The gap was too tight to be coincidence. The foreclosure filing and property transfer had occurred before she'd even received official notification of her uncle's death, which meant they were acting on knowledge that hadn't yet become public. That part unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The next morning, she returned to the parcel location. The plastic mesh barrier had been torn down and replaced with temporary fencing. A small construction sign leaned against the gate, bent at the corners with a company name she didn't recognize. No one was working, but fresh tire tracks carved into the earth showed someone had been there recently. She walked the perimeter, taking photographs, noting the markers, the erosion patterns, the position of survey stakes. When she reached the southern edge of the lot, she saw something that didn't fit a narrow trench, partially refilled, with segments of old conduit sticking up through the soil. Utility infrastructure, possibly old cable routing, maybe water. It hadn't been documented in the parcel's public file. She photographed it too, already composing the language in her mind for a motion to preserve environmental features pending verification of public utility involvement. It's a small procedural step, but another wedge in the wall. The idea was not to blow the door down, but to jam it open wide enough to see who was standing behind it. She wasn't hunting a conspiracy. This wasn't a thriller. This was a legal failure wrapped in administrative laziness and hidden under transactional fraud. But that didn't make it less dangerous. It just made it harder to see coming, harder to prove, and harder to undo if left unchallenged. She had no interest in being dramatic. She had every interest in being right. Cassandra returned to the office of her legal colleague David Layton a day after visiting the parcel and finding the construction fencing in place. She had uploaded the photos to a secured shared folder and annotated each image with metadata timestamp, GPS coordinates, elevation, and notes on what appeared in the frame. It was something she'd learned during a dispute over an old property line in Vermont, where photographic detail had shifted the burden of proof. She was no stranger to the nuances of land ownership, easement rights, or the slow creep of bureaucratic erosion, but this case had a smell to it, a combination of opportunism and procedural manipulation. That was the part that bothered her the most. Not that a piece of land had been taken under the guise of tax forfeiture, but that the system allowed someone to move swiftly through legal gray areas while those meant to challenge the process were either uninformed, outpaced, or ignored. David studied the images with a kind of detached professionalism that belied his concern. He sat back, hands folded across his stomach, and nodded to himself. That trench. "Sss," he said, tapping the image with the visible conduit, "is going to be more important than it looks. If there's any active or semi-active infrastructure buried under there, especially anything tied to a public utility you've got standing to block further development until the environmental or civic impact is reviewed. That gives us time. And more importantly, leverage." Cassandra nodded, already a few steps ahead. "I'll file a preservation request with the State Utility Board and carbon copy the County Commission. Even if they brush it off, it plants the seed. And it gives us a point of contact that bypasses the assessor's office, which I don't trust." The next step was to draft and file a formal cease and desist against Galveston Land Management. Not because it would stop anything by itself, but because it would force them to respond, either with legal counsel or silence, both of which were revealing. If they responded, Cassandra and David would see who stood behind the curtain. If they didn't, it would strengthen their case for emergency injunctive relief. The letter was sent by certified mail, courier, and email redundancy wasn't paranoia, it was protocol. Every message was logged. Every receipt saved. Every response, or lack thereof, recorded. 3 days later, Cassandra received a letter not from Galveston, but from a law firm in Albany representing a subsidiary called Westridge Holdings, which had, according to their statement, entered into a pending agreement to acquire certain development rights from Galveston. The letter was overly cordial, filled with vague references to good faith negotiations and community partnership initiatives, and it ended with a mild warning that any continued disruption to site operations may constitute interference with commercial activity. The threat was deliberately softened, but it was there. Cassandra read it twice, then passed it to David, who smirked and said, "Classic distance play. They're trying to create a corporate buffer between you and the money. If Galveston goes down, Westridge shrugs and says we were just trying to invest locally. It's a game of legal musical chairs." But something didn't fit. The letter claimed Westridge was in the due diligence phase, but the site activity suggested otherwise. Contractors don't dig utility trenches during due diligence. They certainly don't replace boundary markers and install pre-construction fencing if they think the title is still in question. Cassandra pulled up the county's online building permit system and searched for any recent applications tied to the parcel ID. There were none, which meant either the work was unpermitted or being processed through a different channel. She called the zoning office and spent nearly an hour on hold, bouncing between departments, only to be told that the most recent submission under that parcel was flagged incomplete. No signatures, no payment, no permit. She shared this with David, who immediately filed a complaint with the zoning board for unauthorized land modification. Simultaneously, Cassandra submitted a separate inquiry under the state's environmental review trigger law, arguing that unpermitted excavation near a watershed corridor could constitute a violation, especially if the land had previously hosted public utility lines. This wasn't a bluff. She'd photographed rusted lockboxes near the trench, one of which bore the faded logo of a now-defunct telecom carrier. Old infrastructure wasn't uncommon in these rural pockets, but most of it was simply abandoned and ignored until someone needed the land. While the legal motions moved forward, Cassandra started getting phone calls from unfamiliar numbers. At first, she ignored them. Then the voicemail started. A clipped male voice, never identifying himself, began leaving messages. "This is a misunderstanding. There's no need to escalate things. Then, later, people have a right to develop what they own. It's not personal." The third message was different. "You're making it harder than it needs to be. Think about what you're trying to preserve. Think about what you might lose instead." She forwarded the recordings to David, who instructed her to file a police report just to have documentation in place. Not because he expected intervention. Local enforcement rarely jumped into civil disputes, but because it was about building a case from every angle. It was during this time that Cassandra was notified that her temporary injunction had been approved. The court order froze all further development on the parcel until the probate challenge and title dispute could be resolved. It was a procedural win, but one that wouldn't hold forever. Injunctions bought time, not victory. And now that time was ticking for the other side. A week after the injunction, the construction fence was taken down. The sign disappeared. The workers stopped coming, but Cassandra didn't take it as a retreat. It felt more like recalibration, like they were regrouping behind closed doors, waiting for her to slip, to miss a deadline, to fold under pressure. Instead, she went further. She filed a discovery request through the court to unmask the financial structure behind Galveston and Westridge. Her goal wasn't to find a villain, it was to find the anchor point. Somewhere in the tangle of holding companies and shell filings, there would be a name, an entity that actually handled the money. That's where pressure mattered. That's where risk lived. During this process, David received an anonymous tip through a legal colleague who had worked on a similar case in a neighboring county. The message was simple: check their chain of acquisition. Look for bulk property flips during off-quarter cycles. They've been targeting probate delays since early last year. That same week, Cassandra received another piece of mail, this time addressed not to her, but to her uncle, marked return to sender. It was a delinquent tax notice dated 3 months after his death, postmarked late. Her name, as executor, was not listed anywhere on it. It had been sent to an address that hadn't been used in 20 years, a P.O. box her uncle had closed when she was still in law school. When she took the envelope to the post office, they confirmed the box had not been active in years, which meant someone had used an outdated record to justify failed contact, a critical justification in tax forfeiture cases. She photographed the envelope, retained the confirmation slip, and attached both to her probate filing as evidence of improper notification. At this point, her case was no longer a question of whether the land had been taken unfairly, it was about proving how. She still hadn't received direct contact from anyone at Galveston. No apology, no negotiation, just silence wrapped in legal maneuvering. That silence became its own kind of answer. When people believe they're entitled, they rarely feel the need to explain. And when people are hiding something, they rarely risk speaking aloud. But Cassandra was not afraid of process. She respected it, trusted it. Even when it failed, she believed in its capacity to be forced back into shape. That belief wasn't naive, it was professional muscle memory. And now that belief was being tested not in a classroom or a court brief, but on a tract of land that bore her name, through a fight she had never asked for, but would not walk away from. Because someone somewhere had made a decision, perhaps small at the time, maybe buried in paperwork, to treat a life's inheritance as a disposable asset. And now, that decision had a consequence. Well, the turning point came not with a confrontation, but through a footnote. Cassandra had been combing through procurement records from the previous fiscal year, not for her parcel specifically, but for patterns in property acquisition across the county. It was an exhaustive and largely thankless task, one she assigned to a paralegal working under David's supervision. The paralegal, a quietly competent graduate student named Ethan, had flagged a line in the quarterly filing from the county's Land Redistribution Committee that seemed out of place. The line read, "Batch Asset Reassignment Authorized per 6.04, B, pending verification of abandonment criteria." Most entries in that section referred to post-industrial properties or tracts zoned for agricultural conversion. But among them was a parcel number Cassandra immediately recognized, her uncle's. What drew her attention wasn't just the inclusion, but the timestamp it had been entered 9 days before Henry's death was officially recorded by the probate court. That alone wouldn't constitute wrongdoing. Death certificates often lagged behind the actual date. But the reassignment had moved forward without any pause or reevaluation after the record became public. The flag indicating pending verification had been marked resolved within 48 hours, an impossibly short period under normal standards, especially for a death-triggered succession. Cassandra forwarded the record to David, who responded with a single sentence, "This is your breach point." The next day, she filed an emergency motion to compel disclosure of internal communications related to the parcel's reassignment. The motion was aggressive, and the language deliberated accused the county's land office of either gross negligence or administrative misconduct, and it included the questionable tax notice with the invalid mailing address as supporting evidence. Within 48 hours, the court approved limited discovery. They would get access to communication logs, internal memos, and system records surrounding the reassignment and sale of the parcel. It wasn't full access, but it was enough to shake the tree. When the logs arrived, they revealed what she suspected, though the details still stunned her. The system had auto-flagged the parcel for probate hold after receiving a data input from the Department of Health confirming Henry's death. The hold should have suspended all activity. Instead, a manual override had been entered under the username of a temporary contract employee, someone listed in the system as having been onboarded for a special transitionary digitization project that spanned only a 3-month window. That window aligned perfectly with the forfeiture process that swept up not just her uncle's property, but 6 others, each with similar profiles: aging owners, no surviving spouse, no children, succession in progress or delayed. Cassandra went still after reading that part. It was one thing to suspect systemic targeting. It was another to see it unfold through line item timestamps, keystrokes, and internal authorization tags that, when viewed in sequence, painted a picture of quiet, procedural theft. Procedural theft. These weren't criminals breaking into homes. These were administrators using legal blind spots as tools. And by exploiting probate delays and relying on outdated records to declare properties abandoned, they created just enough plausible deniability to move parcels into holding companies without immediate backlash. She and David convened that afternoon to build their next move. Cassandra proposed drafting a formal grievance to the State Auditor General, documenting not just her case, but the pattern now evident across multiple transactions. David agreed, but advised one additional step: contact the families of the other affected properties. Not to start a class action, not yet, but to quietly verify that the pattern extended beyond her case and had a human cost that couldn't be dismissed. Over the next several days, Cassandra made those calls. She approached each one carefully, respectfully, explaining who she was and why she was contacting them. Most of the conversations were short, strained by grief or confusion. Some families hadn't even realized the property had been transferred. One woman, a retired teacher, broke down sobbing when Cassandra mentioned the parcel number her brother's land, gone without notice, listed now under development for a sustainable living cooperative. Another family had tried to claim inheritance but were told the records showed no eligible successors. By the end of the week, Cassandra had 4 formal declarations from other heirs, all confirming the same circumstances: late or incorrect notices, questionable tax documentation, and rushed forfeiture proceedings. She compiled them into an addendum to her filing with the probate court and sent the same dossier to the state auditor's office with a cover letter that laid out the systemic risks of administrative abuse within property reassignment procedures. The letter wasn't emotional. It was clinical, structured, annotated. It concluded with a single line that held the weight of every hour she'd spent building her case. This is not a bureaucratic error. It is a method. While they waited for a response from the Auditor General, something else happened, something quiet but unsettling. The office building where David's firm rented space was broken into over the weekend. Nothing of value was stolen, no computers or files removed, no vandalism. Just locks picked, lights left on, and drawers disturbed. David didn't say much about it when he called Cassandra, but his voice was flatter than usual. She listened carefully, then asked the one question that mattered. "Was our file touched?" "Nothing taken," he said, "but it was opened." They agreed to shift all records to off-site encrypted storage. Cassandra duplicated every physical document, flash drive, and hard copy onto 2 separate drives. One she locked in a private deposit box under a trust. The other she gave to a third-party escrow service with instructions to release it only under specific conditions. She didn't believe she was in danger, but she no longer assumed that professionalism and process could shield her from people who viewed the law as an obstacle instead of a boundary. Soon after, they received word from the state auditor's office. A review had been initiated, not an investigation, but a preliminary inquiry into the reassignment process that affected her uncle's land and others. It wasn't justice. It wasn't accountability. But it was proof that someone beyond the county was now watching. That same week, a new letter arrived. This time, it came from a different law firm representing Galveston. It was polite, almost deferential. It acknowledged that due to administrative inconsistencies in the parcel's forfeiture, Galveston was willing to relinquish interest in the land pending mutual non-disparagement and waiver of further litigation. Cassandra sat in her kitchen, the letter on the table, her hand resting on the edge of her coffee mug as she read the offer twice. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something closer to confirmation. They wanted out not because they feared consequences, but because the quiet had broken. She had made noise in places they didn't want attention. David reviewed the offer and advised her not to accept it outright. Instead, they countered not with demands, but with conditions. Cassandra would reclaim the property under probate reversion. The company would cover administrative costs and fees, and all correspondence would be preserved, not buried. It was a professional way of saying, "I see you. You don't get to disappear." In the days that followed, she visited the parcel again. It was still quiet. The fencing gone, the trench partially filled, the land returned to its waiting state. It looked untouched to the untrained eye. But Cassandra knew better. She stood near the edge of the old foundation, where the trees cast long shadows across the clearing, and felt something shift not in the air but in herself. What had started as an obligation to paperwork had become something else, something harder to name. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't even victory. It was reclamation not just of land, but of the boundary between process and predation, between inheritance and theft, between silence and reply. Cassandra didn't expect quiet to last. If the sudden shift in tone from Galveston's legal team had offered any illusion of resolution, it was quickly shattered within 2 weeks. A certified letter arrived at her university office, this time from a previously uninvolved entity, Midwell Carson, a regional firm known for representing corporate interests in complex real estate arbitration. The letter was framed in deceptively neutral language but bordered with unmistakable aggression. It accused Cassandra of malicious interference in legitimate property development, citing the temporary injunction she had secured and the subsequent halt in construction as actions that had caused financial disruption to ongoing investor partnerships. Buried in the second page was the threat of a civil countersuit if she did not withdraw her opposition to property reassignment and acknowledge the jurisdictional finality of the prior sale. The wording was slippery. Jurisdictional finality wasn't a real term. It was meant to sound unchallengeable. But Cassandra knew better. She read the letter once, then a second time, this time for tone rather than content. It didn't feel like a serious legal position. It felt like a signal. Someone, likely from Westridge Holdings or their financial backers, had escalated the matter beyond Galveston's original handlers, not to fight her in court, but to pressure her back into silence through institutional intimidation. It was a play she recognized from her own lectures. When control is slipping, some players don't double down on law, they deploy scale, make the room louder, and hope you blink first. David confirmed the letter's intent as soon as he read it. It's a bluff, but not an idle one. They're layering pressure through firms with reputations. They know you can't match them financially if this stretches out, so they'll drag you to the edge of exhaustion and hope you decide the land isn't worth it. Cassandra didn't answer. She was already writing a response in her head, not for Midwell Carson, but for the judge presiding over the probate case. If the opposing party wanted to posture as if the sale had been legitimate and irrevocable, it was time to compel testimony from the county officials who had approved the reassignment under suspicious circumstances. She and David filed a motion that afternoon requesting subpoenas for 3 individuals: the temporary clerk who had issued the override in the digital system, the head of the county land office, and the regional compliance officer who had certified the forfeiture as complete despite the estate flag. Within days, they received notice that the judge had granted the subpoenas with a limited scope, just enough to begin breaking open the network of decision-making that had moved her uncle's land so quickly from probate limbo into corporate control. It was around this time that Cassandra noticed changes in her day-to-day life. Nothing overt at first. Her office door was found unlocked one morning, though she was sure she had locked it the night before. An anonymous email landed in her inbox, short, clipped, and unsigned, reading only, "Let it go. You're not built for this kind of fight." Her mailroom reported that 2 of her letters had been accidentally shredded during delivery. At home, her building manager mentioned that someone had asked about her apartment during the day, claiming to be a maintenance inspector. No name, no paperwork. Cassandra requested the building's visitor log and found the entry blank. She didn't panic, but she felt the shift in atmosphere. What had been a legal dispute was now becoming something else, something personal, intimate, and invisible. She told David everything. He didn't try to minimize it. You're pushing against people who operate in the soft edges of law. They don't expect resistance. They definitely don't expect someone with credentials and patience. So now they want you uncomfortable, isolated, distracted. They took steps. David arranged for all legal files to be mirrored into a secure cloud vault outside of their firm's jurisdiction. Cassandra began conducting all communications through a hardened encrypted email system. She installed cameras in her apartment and office. A colleague in the university's department agreed to quietly monitor any access attempts to her digital accounts. None of this was paranoia. It was procedural armor, a way to keep pressure contained so that it wouldn't bleed into her focus. Because focus was now more important than ever. The court date for the evidentiary hearing was set for the following month. In preparation, David's team pulled documentation from 3 counties where similar fast-track forfeitures had occurred. They discovered that 2 of the other affected heirs Cassandra had contacted earlier had already been approached with settlement offers conditioned on signing gag clauses. One of them, a nurse named Rachel, whose father's land had been seized under the same process, sent Cassandra a copy of the agreement she was asked to sign. It read like a script: acknowledgement of no wrongdoing, release of all claims, waiver of media contact, and explicit denial of fraud. Rachel had refused to sign, citing Cassandra's case as the reason she didn't believe the story anymore. That moment marked a change. Cassandra no longer felt like she was defending only her own inheritance. What had started as a personal violation had evolved into the exposure of a broader structure, one that relied on silence, bureaucracy, and fragmented families who lacked the means to contest what was being taken from them. Now, with testimony scheduled and subpoenas served, that structure was beginning to crack. But the pressure escalated accordingly. A story appeared in a local blog, quoting unnamed sources, alleging that Cassandra was pursuing her case out of vindictive motives, suggesting a rift between her and her late uncle. The article referenced academic tensions, hinted at misappropriated trust, and painted her as an opportunist leveraging legal systems for personal gain. David traced the domain of the blog to a media PR subcontractor linked to one of the shell companies under Westridge's portfolio. The article was quickly taken down after a cease and desist, but the message had been sent. They weren't going to win in court. So they were shifting to character. Cassandra didn't respond publicly. Instead, she filed a formal complaint with the state bar against Midwell Carson for engaging in extrajudicial defamation tied to ongoing litigation. She knew the complaint would likely go nowhere, but again, it was about establishing narrative and record. Every move they made was now being logged, named, and answered. Then came the leak. An anonymous whistleblower submitted a packet of documents to David's office internal communications between the regional land office and the development advisory firm whose members had direct contact with both Galveston and the county assessor's office. The emails, marked confidential, detailed strategic coordination for identifying probate fragmented parcels with delayed executor assignment, explicitly referencing the value of timing-based acquisitions prior to estate formalization. One message even named Cassandra's parcel specifically, noting that the delay in her notification presented an advantage window. The leak was clean, no metadata tying it to a sender, but authentic. David immediately moved to file it under seal with the probate court and to initiate a parallel filing with the Auditor General's office. That leak turned the tide. At the next hearing, the judge acknowledged the documents as part of the evidentiary record and approved Cassandra's motion for full discovery into Galveston's acquisition trail. The subpoenas were expanded, the freeze on the property extended, and the regional compliance officer was formally asked to appear and explain why procedural safeguards had been ignored. Still, Cassandra didn't celebrate. The game wasn't over, and she knew better than to mistake exposure for accountability. What mattered now was maintaining the line-holding pressure until the structure behind Galveston began to buckle under scrutiny. Westridge had gone quiet. Midwell Carson, too. The silence this time didn't feel like a pause. It felt like retreat disguised as regrouping. But Cassandra kept her eyes forward. One night, alone in her apartment, she pulled out the box of papers her uncle had left behind the ones she hadn't yet sorted. Among the yellowing folders and carbon-copied correspondence, she found a letter he'd written but never mailed, addressed to her, dated 6 months before his death. It wasn't emotional, it was precise, factual, dry even. But in it, he explained why he'd named her executor. He trusted her to handle what came next. Not because of sentiment, because of her ability to see systems clearly, and to act, not react. The final line read, "This land isn't worth its weight in gold. But maybe it's worth its weight in noise." She sat for a long time after reading that. Not crying. Not proud. Just still. Because she understood now, in a way she hadn't before, that her fight had become larger than she had intended. And that walking away, especially now, would mean confirming to the people who engineered this theft that the system worked just fine as long as no one cared enough to press back. She wasn't angry anymore. She was resolved. The courtroom on the morning of the hearing was plain, almost sterile, with walls that looked recently painted and yet still managed to carry the stale weight of years of unresolved matters. There was no drama in the room's design, no grandeur, just a long oak bench, a judge seated behind it, 2 rows of pew-like chairs, and fluorescent lights humming just slightly off frequency. It was not the kind of place where justice felt cinematic. It was the kind of place where systems protected themselves unless forced not to. Cassandra sat at the petitioner's table with David beside her, the bundle of evidence and supporting documents arranged like a quiet fortress between them. Across the aisle, the representatives for Galveston Land Management had changed again this time. A senior attorney from a larger firm whose name Cassandra had only seen once before on a land bank dispute in another state. It was a subtle but telling move. They had escalated the level of defense not because they were confident, but because they were cornered. The hearing opened with procedural acknowledgments, the judge reviewing motions, filings, and the list of parties. Then the testimony began. First was the temporary clerk, the contract employee whose credentials had authorized the override of the estate hold in the system. He arrived in an ill-fitting blazer, looking like someone who had not expected to be here, and certainly not to be questioned under oath. His voice was quiet as he confirmed that yes, he had executed a digital override on the parcel, and no, he did not verify the estate flag himself. He had simply followed the directive forwarded by a manager in his department who, according to him, had streamlined several parcels for transfer due to backlog and administrative delay. When asked if he had ever overridden estate flags before, he hesitated before answering, "I don't know. We weren't trained to differentiate." The judge's expression did not change, but the silence afterward spoke volumes. Next was the county compliance officer, the person who had signed off on the reassignment as complete. She was polished, prepared, and defensive. Her statement began with a careful listing of duties, emphasizing the high volume of parcels and the pressures of jurisdictional backlog. She spoke in the language of bureaucratic fatigue, explaining that she had no reason to question the system's output because internal safeguards were presumed functional. But under cross-examination, David walked her through the sequence of system alerts, the data logs that indicated manual intervention, and the metadata from the emails recovered during discovery. With each point, her posture shifted first rigid, then less so. Until by the end of the questioning she answered only in short, hedging phrases. When Cassandra took the stand, she did not rehearse empathy or emotion. She explained her role as executor, the legal timeline of notification, and the sequence of events that had unfolded from the moment she arrived at the parcel and found it blocked off. She presented the certified documents, the missed notifications, the mail sent to a defunct post office box, the late tax notice, the unpermitted construction, and the falsified assumptions of abandonment. She did not speak from outrage. She spoke from process, from law, from a trained understanding of how these mechanisms worked and how they had been manipulated. David followed with closing arguments that laid bare the architecture of the theft, not an impulsive error, but a structured circumvention of protocol. He emphasized the documents from the whistleblower, the batch file flagging multiple properties and similar succession delays, the economic incentive to reassign quiet parcels, and the silence of the companies involved until legal action made that silence untenable. He closed by saying, "This is not a case of property mismanagement. It is a case of procedural conquest. And if the court does not reverse this transfer, it will signal that the law rewards speed, not legitimacy." The defense tried to reposition the events as a tragic intersection of clerical oversight and poor timing. They acknowledged the failure to notify, the irregular filing of tax claims, but insisted these were errors of scale, not intent. They suggested restitution, even offering to facilitate retransfer of the parcel under new documentation, as long as litigation ceased and public filings were minimized. The judge interrupted only once to ask whether the land company had ever attempted to contact the estate directly after learning of Cassandra's appointment. The answer was no. The judge requested a recess. Cassandra remained in her seat, still and silent. She did not speculate on the ruling. She had done everything within the framework available to her. Her evidence was complete, her argument airtight. Whether or not that mattered in this room was not her responsibility. When the judge returned, the decision was brief but precise. The court ruled that the forfeiture process had failed to observe due process requirements in a manner that constitutes a fundamental failure of administrative integrity. The parcel's transfer to Galveston Land Management was deemed null. Authority reverted to the estate, and all subsequent filings, including development permits and corporate claims, were struck from the record. Additionally, the court referred the matter to the State Auditor General for review of the broader procedural irregularities identified during discovery. Cassandra did not exhale. She did not smile. She simply stood, nodded once to the judge, and began gathering her papers. Around her, the courtroom stirred, voices resumed, documents rustled, chairs scraped against linoleum. But she remained steady. The ruling did not feel like victory. It felt like correction. She left the building into a gray sky that threatened rain, her coat buttoned tight, her steps careful. She walked without rush, without pause, to where her car waited near the curb. David followed, quiet for a few seconds before speaking. "You just forced a rollback on a state-recognized title transfer." She didn't look at him when she answered. "Why?" "I forced recognition of a line that never should have been crossed." He nodded once, and neither of them said more. Not because there wasn't more to say, but because everything that mattered had been documented, entered into record, both preserved in a way that couldn't be erased by silence or corporate restructuring. Later that night, Cassandra sat at her desk, reading through the judge's written opinion. The language was formal, even dry, but she found comfort in its logic. The court had acknowledged each step of her argument, each procedural flaw, each point of data. And in doing so, it had confirmed something deeper than ownership. It had confirmed that resistance, even through cold documentation and patience, still mattered. She closed the file, shut off the lamp, and sat in the quiet. She wasn't thinking about the land anymore. Not its market value. Not the trees. Not the potential for development or preservation. She was thinking about the next parcel, the next executor who wouldn't be a lawyer, who wouldn't have resources, who wouldn't have the time or strength to push back. And she realized then that the hearing, the fight, the ruling, none of it had been about inheritance in the conventional sense. It had been about declaring within a silent system that not all losses go unnoticed, and that some names, when written on court documents, will not fold quietly into the margins. The days that followed the ruling passed in a way that felt dissonant to Cassandra, as if the inertia of the previous months hadn't yet realized it had permission to stop. She continued her routine, taught her classes, reviewed student papers, and responded to departmental emails with practiced calm, but the shift had already occurred. Something inside her had recalibrated. She no longer moved from task to task as a form of discipline or performance. She moved through them with the silent knowledge that she had crossed a threshold few ever reached. She had held the system accountable on its own terms, and it had yielded. Not because it wanted to, but because she refused to let it ignore her. The parcel was returned to the estate without fanfare. No ceremony, no notice to the public, no letter of apology from the companies that had attempted to strip it away. A new deed was issued and registered. The erroneous tax forfeiture filings were formally nullified and struck from the county records. The clerk who had executed the override was quietly dismissed from his contract position. The compliance officer resigned under the guise of administrative restructuring. The developer, Westridge Holdings, shifted its focus to a different region, shedding its LLC partners like skin, vanishing behind another chain of limited liability and vague press releases. In the end, no one claimed responsibility, but they all walked away from the mess they had created. That, too, was part of the design. And Cassandra didn't waste time chasing names she knew had already disappeared from directories and inboxes. What mattered had already been established on record, in law, and in consequence. Instead of holding on to the land, she made the decision to sell it. Not to another development firm, not to a profit-seeking interest, but to a conservation trust that maintained protected spaces along the state's inland lake system. She negotiated the sale herself, building a clause into the agreement that barred structural development for the next 50 years and required public access to remain unrestricted. The trust accepted the terms without question. The final documents were signed on a quiet morning without anyone else in attendance. When the check cleared, she deposited the money into an education fund for displaced families fighting similar land disputes. She named the fund after her uncle, not out of sentimentality, but out of precision. His name had been used to justify theft. She wanted it to signify resistance. The university asked her to speak at a public seminar a month later, part of a series on civic accountability and property law. She hadn't planned to accept. For weeks, she'd told herself she was too tired, too focused on catching up, too immersed in student work, to give a presentation on a subject that had consumed every part of her life. But when she finally stood at the lectern addressing a room of faculty, students, and community members, she didn't speak about the parcel. She spoke about process. About the failure of automatic systems, about the way property law, often treated as cold and technical, could become a vector for erasure if left unexamined. She spoke not about the victory of returning what was taken, but about the necessity of noticing when something disappears quietly, legally, and permanently. After the seminar, a student approached her young, anxious, clearly moved by the story but unsure how to speak about it. He asked what made her keep going when it would have been easier to let it go. Cassandra didn't respond immediately. Then she said, "Because the process failed, but I didn't." She didn't elaborate. There was nothing else to add. The student nodded, not fully understanding yet, but perhaps someday he would. She still kept a copy of the court's final ruling in a folder on her desk, not out of vanity, but because occasionally she would receive emails from individuals who had heard about her case through a passing reference in a journal, or who had been forwarded her seminar notes by a friend. They weren't looking for advice. They were looking for confirmation that someone had stood against the tide and hadn't been swallowed by it. Cassandra responded to each one briefly but honestly. She didn't offer false hope. She offered structure, contact information, places to begin. It wasn't her job to fix every failure, but it was her responsibility now to ensure that no one had to begin from the place she started, in silence, in confusion, and in the assumption that the system must be right because it was large and loud. One evening, while closing her office, she paused by the window. The city was quiet beneath her dim office lights, still burning in distant towers, traffic flowing and steady, blinking rhythm below. She stood there longer than necessary, not thinking about the case, not thinking about the land. She was thinking about noise, about how much of it fills the world in meaningless bursts, and how sometimes the only thing louder than noise is quiet that refuses to vanish. What she had done wasn't dramatic, wasn't televised or shouted from a podium. It had happened in filings, in hearings, in rooms with bad lighting and cheap carpet. But it happened. It was real, and it would remain real whether or not anyone chose to notice. Cassandra turned off the light and locked the door behind her.